Hey everybody, I have a few minutes to kill before an appointment, so I thought I'd talk to you briefly about a viewer question. The question was, why did it take so long for Disney to have competition when it came to animated feature films? Disney started making animated feature films in the late 1930s, and it wasn't until really the 1980s, almost 50 years later, maybe about 40 or so years later, where you started to see other major studios competing with Disney. Now, of course, there were various independent studios or smaller studios from around the world that did release feature films that were animated throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. It did happen. But it wasn't really until the 80s that you started seeing the major studios or major competitors step up and trying to be making consistent animated feature films. Why is that the case? The primary reason for this is because animation takes 4 years to make. Most of the time, that's the process. It takes about 4 years for most films to go through the development cycle where you have concept, you have early production, you have the starting of animation after you have storyboarding and so forth. It takes about 4 years to get it all done, most of the time. Now, that is a big financial investment to do a film that is at the same quality of Disney and what they typically did. Disney was able to get away with this because they took a financial risk that most production houses or studios just were not willing to do. Disney went ahead and got a line of credit to make the films on their own. This meant that if a film burned, if it did very poorly at the box office, Disney could have essentially fallen apart. Now, they did have other lines of money coming in, like toys and lunchboxes and things, but primarily their feature films were the major moneymaker for the studio. So if they put out a true bomb, they could have been in huge danger. So they were running this risk for many years until Disney really became such a large studio, especially in the 90s, 2000s and things, where it got to a point where Disney could have a bomb and survive it. But in the early days, man, they basically ran the risk of virtually every film of going into bankruptcy. And luckily, they kept making enough money where they stayed alive, which is really a testament to Disney and their power. Most studios really, though, didn't want to do that. It's a huge financial risk. Nobody wants to put so many people out of work. A lot of people don't like to take that kind of risk, and it's understandable why. So most studios decided not to take that risk, and the ones that did tended to be smaller, independent studios that didn't have much to lose, or studios that were relatively small and made very, very low-cost films where they could still theoretically survive. Or if they didn't survive, they were small enough where it wasn't the end of the world. Most larger studios, though, that had tons and tons of people on their staff just weren't willing to take that risk. Now, there was one studio that did take another option, and it turned out to bite them. That's the Fleischers in the late 1930s and into the 1940s. The Fleischers decided not to risk their whole studio and to risk everyone losing their jobs and losing their money and all that. What the Fleischers did was they actually went to Paramount and they signed a deal where Paramount basically was putting the money into the movies, and they got a lot of the profits back. And the Fleischers decided to do this because it was less of a risk. However, because the Fleischers went with the studio, it meant if the film didn't do well, Paramount could take them over, essentially. That was the deal. So if Paramount at some point felt that the income was not meeting expectations, they had the right to basically ask the Fleischer brothers to turn in their resignations, and they would take over the Fleischer studio. After the film Mr. Bug Goes to Town, that's exactly what happened. Film bombed. The Fleischer shorts weren't exactly setting the world on fire at that point. And on top of it, the Fleischer brothers were having a lot of internal fighting between the brothers. And so with all of that negativity with the studio, Paramount called their contract and said, you need to turn in your resignation. They took over the studio, and it became Famous Studios. And so that's an example, though, of why Disney took the risk that he did. Disney, when he lost Oswald the Lucky Rabbit in the late 1920s, learned how important it was to retain his creative rights and to receive as much of the return on his investment as possible. So Disney took the risk, and banks, even when films weren't doing that great or didn't have the greatest of projections, the banks still would go ahead and lend them money because it was in their financial interest to do so. Disney tended to do pretty well making money. And so the bank, and I believe it was Bank of America, was willing to go ahead and give them money because it was a decent risk. And it was in their interest for Disney to be able to finish the film, even if it went a bit over budget, so that they could make their money back. So Disney was able to survive. The Fleischer brothers did not, because once their film didn't do well, Paramount, who was bankrolling the film, said, I'm sorry, you no longer control your own company. And so if you think about those two options, a lot of smaller companies are the only ones that are going to take that risk. The larger production houses didn't want to take the risk of financial windfall going to the bank. They didn't want to necessarily lose the studio to the larger production, whether it be MGM, Warner Brothers, or whatever. So they just decided not to go that route. Hopefully that answers your question. Hopefully this can stir some conversation, and I will talk to you guys again soon. Bye-bye.